Another key criteria informing selection bias is whether the disaster involves people or places perceived to be politically or economically important. A comparative analysis of 6 major disasters by Karma International concluded that, quote, there appears to be no link between the scale of a disaster and media interest in the story, and instead, the newsworthiness of a disaster is directly related to the perceived political and economic importance of those involved, not the level of human suffering. So think back to the California wildfires of 2025, of 2018. That disaster was amplified because a lot of celebrities were impacted, and they became the face of the disaster in some instances. Solomon and Henderson find that it is the identity of the victims and their relationship to the readers that carry the most weight in the selection and salience of news stories. So do editors and reporters believe that their readers will share cultural affinities with the victims? This can be tied to an us-them binary, an ethnocentric worldview, and a sense of sameness and comfort and familiarity. This political or economic importance can be also tied to national level interests in the nation in question. So do people in the readership country have relatives in the country facing the disaster? Do they go there on holiday? Do they have business ties and economic trade agreements? Is there military interest in that country? All of these factors bump up the perceived importance and therefore the media coverage. News coverage of disasters, in fact, varies by continent. While television networks cover more than 15% of the disasters in Europe and South Central America, they show less than 5% of the disasters in the African continent and the Pacific. One argument made by Eisensee and Stromberg is that disasters in Africa tend to get less coverage than the ones in Asia because they are, quote, less spectacular, unquote, with more droughts and food shortages occurring there relative to Asia. So here, this idea is that certain continents are more likely to have slower disasters versus rapid onset dramatic disasters, which we talked about earlier. However, if we control for disaster type, along with other factors such as the number of people killed and the timing of the news, turns out there's no significant difference between coverage of African and Asian disasters. Instead, a huge difference emerges between coverage of Africa, Asia, and the Pacific on the one hand, and Europe and South and Central America on the other. Look at what this figure is showing us. According to these researchers' estimates, 45 times as many people would have to die in an African disaster for it to garner the same media attention as a European one. And this visualization really shows the extent of this bias. In Europe, it only takes 1 death for a disaster to receive news coverage, but in Africa, it takes 45 and the Pacific, 91. ABC's news slogan is, quote, see the whole picture. But we could ask, what exactly is included in this imagined whole picture? And CNN's slogan is, quote, go there, unquote. But where are they actually going? Not everywhere equally. Let's go deeper into selection bias with an example. Porter and Evans in 2020 did a comparative analysis of national newspaper disaster coverage in the United Kingdom. Peter and Evans analyzed 2 disasters. They chose the 2017 South Asian floods and monsoon in Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, and Nepal, and the 2017 Hurricane Harvey and floods in Houston, Texas, in the United States. The monsoon that hit South Asia brought floods and landslides, destroyed farmlands, and displaced millions of people. 1,300 people are estimated to have died, with another 45 million affected. Hurricane Harvey in 2017 made landfall in Texas and led to $125 billion in damages, which is the costliest tropical cyclone in U.S. history. 106 people died in the USA, which is only a percentage of the 1,300 people in the South Asian floods, and 30,000 people were displaced in Hurricane Harvey, as opposed to 45 million people affected. Now, despite these disasters differing in their scale and location, their selection brings comparative advantages. They should give us insight into media selection bias. So the UK is located roughly in between the location of both disasters. So geographical bias should be eliminated. In other words, one disaster shouldn't get more coverage just because it is physically closer to the UK. Both disasters also caused unprecedented damage and loss of life, though more people were harmed and affected in the South Asian floods. The impacts of both disasters were connected to climate change, and importantly, the timing of the disasters overlapped, which offers a clear and consistent baseline from which to compare how the events were covered. So, how much coverage did each disaster get in UK newspaper articles? There are 4 key findings related to selection bias. First, a reporting bias was found in the number of articles published. In this figure, the number of articles published about Hurricane Harvey by month is represented in the blue, and the number of articles published about the South Asian monsoon by month is represented by the red. We can see a really substantial discrepancy. Second, there was also a bias in the length of those articles. Hurricane Harvey in the US got more words per article, and this meant that Hurricane Harvey articles were more complex with more themes reported. Third, there was a difference in the duration of coverage. Hurricane Harvey stayed in the news for longer. It stayed in the news for 23 weeks versus the South Asian monsoon being in the news for just 10 weeks. Lastly, Hurricane Harvey reporting was also more prominently placed. For example, it was more likely to be on the front page of a newspaper rather than in the middle or at the back. The authors of the study concluded that there was more coverage of the global north disaster, and they suggest this is tied to the perceived relevance of the United States to the United Kingdom politically, economically, and socially, and that this shaped the increased coverage. Let's turn to our 4th form of selection bias. The likelihood of media coverage increases if the disaster is easier for news agencies to report on. Disasters closer to a center of power tend to get more coverage. For example, a disaster in downtown Vancouver would likely get more attention than a disaster in a small town in northern BC. Not necessarily because of the disaster itself, but because of its proximity to news stations. A remote northern town would be harder and more expensive for media to get to. The organizational model of media coverage tries to explain some patterns of bias by looking at the structure of traditional media as a social institution. For example, economics shape coverage. With the rise of social media and changing technology has come budget cuts in traditional media, like news through newspapers and television. And it costs a lot of money to send reporters into the field far away overnight, to pay for the hotel, food, transportation. And so editors are motivated to make coverage selection choices partially in line with keeping costs low. Let's look at an example of rural-urban disparities in disaster reporting in Tamil Nadu. Researchers have found that Tamil Nadu media have geographical disparities in the depth and content of their disaster reporting. Disaster events and their recovery process received uneven media coverage based on location. For example, reporting on the 2015 South India flood significantly focused on Chennai City, the state capital and a center for media organizations. In contrast, reporting on the impacts in neighboring rural districts was minimal, despite those impacts being substantial. Another example, in 2018, Cyclone Gaija had a severe impact in the south of the state, several hours from the state capital. This cyclone received little attention from national and state media, despite its magnitude. The reporting that did take place on this cyclone was very brief, based on short visits to easily accessible locations, and tended to reflect quick and sometimes remote interviews with authorities that took a congratulatory tone focused on the number of deaths averted through effective evacuation and preparedness. These are not accounts from people on the ground. And the long-term impacts of this cyclone were not captured because there was no follow-up reporting about the recovery process. This uneven representation impacted the external visibility of this disaster. Unfortunately, this media representation seems to have affected the speed and quantity of relief aid and funding for recovery from this cyclone.